when I was about your age, and that was back in the early 80s or thereabouts, and this was particularly true around 1984, but it was true before that too. You know, every generation has its worries, real or imagined, and the primary worry for people of my generation was the nuclear war. And, you know, it was a genuine worry. At one point, many years later, I went down to Arizona to visit an ICBM, a decommissioned ICBM nuclear missile silo. And the ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, were very large rockets, right? They could fly halfway around the world, and it was deep underground and behind very, very thick steel doors. It was light green, you know, that pastel green that everyone seemed to like in the 1950s. It was like pastel green Star Trek console. That's what it looked like. And so we went down. Out in the yard, it was in the desert, out in the yard there was a very, I would say, magical object, for lack of a better word. And that was the nose cone for the ICBM. And it was quite big, about that high, pointed like the point of a bullet, about 3/4 of an inch thick plastic, you know, a kind of a resin. And it was designed to melt on re-entry. So that was just sitting there. So that was fairly thought-provoking, let's put it that way. And then we went into the missile silo. Interestingly enough, appended to the front of it, it had been decommissioned under Reagan, by the way. In the front of it, there was like a museum with artifacts from the 1980s featuring Reagan and Gorbachev meeting multiple times, and it was staffed by these Americans from the South who were grandparent age, and they were just super friendly, and you know, they were happy to be in the museum. It was like going to visit your grandma's nuclear missile silo. And so it was jarring, you know, because it's obviously a portentous place, and yet it was conjoined with hospitality and welcoming. It was surreal in that manner. Anyways, we went into the silo, and they ran us through a simulated launch. So imagine a panel like this made out of metal, except twice as long, with another one of these things at the other end, 16 feet across or so. Basically 1950s technology, but updated. And then imagine that what you had to do to launch it was that there was a guy with a key and there was another guy with a key, and if I remember correctly, the keys were around their necks, although I don't think they were stored around their necks permanently. And so to launch the missile, you had to put the key in the lock, both of you. That was the safety precaution. It had to be two of you. You put the key in the lock and hold it for 10 seconds, and then away the missile goes. And it wasn't as big, the missile wasn't as big as the rockets that went to the moon, but it was plenty big. You know, the silo itself would have easily been as wide as this room is, and perhaps larger, and many, many stories tall, you know, because it was nested underground. So they ran us through a simulated launch, which was surreal, I would say. And then they told us that someone asked, and they said the keys were in once. Now, they wouldn't tell us when, but, you know, that would have been during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we were that close. And we were close again at other times, although perhaps not that close. And there seemed to be another peak of conflict in 1984, when there was a movie showed at that time called The Day After, which at that time garnered more views than any movie ever had on TV. And it was a story about the aftermath of a nuclear war and the people who were left. And it was pretty realistic and pretty frightening. And it turned out, as I found out later, that that movie actually was one of the things that influenced Ronald Reagan to put pressure on or negotiate with the Soviets, depending on how you look at it. And so, well, and then, you know, 5 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. No one saw that coming. And it really didn't collapse in 1989 in some sense, you know, like a huge machine like that doesn't fall apart all at once. It falls apart over time, and then at some point it just becomes unsustainable and topples. And you know, it's like they lost faith in their doctrine, and for good reason. You know that the system in Russia, the Soviet Union, which was a collection of states, an empire, and the system that Mao established in China, and the system that still exists in Korea as a remnant of the Cold War, and systems in Southeast Asia and in Africa, were all predicated on Marxist presuppositions. Presuppositions that were utopian in nature and that posited a utopian future where property was held in common and everyone had enough and everyone was called upon to do what they could, right, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, which is a lovely sentiment, and you can imagine how it would be attractive even intellectually, because of course other systems, all other systems, produce vast disparities in income. It's like a natural law. It's actually governed by, you can model it with a distribution called the Pareto distribution, and the Pareto distribution looks like this. It doesn't look like a normal distribution. A lot of you guys have been told about normal distributions and how many things follow a normal distribution, most things, but that's really a limited case. You can understand a Pareto distribution if you've all played Monopoly, I presume. At the beginning, everyone has the same amount of money. Will include property, the same amount of wealth. And then what happens as the game progresses, and really as a function of chance, I mean, I know you have to use your head a little bit in Monopoly, but the basic rule is just buy everything you can get your hands on and then trade meanly, something like that. So at the beginning everybody has the same amount, and then as you begin to play, if you had enough players, you would develop a normal distribution, because some people would win relatively consistently and some people would lose relatively consistently, and so the money starts to be distributed in a normal distribution. But the thing about money, and the thing about lots of things, is that zero is involved, and zero is a weird place, because if you're playing a trading game and you hit zero, then you're done. And so, and it's very hard to recover from zero, and you know, it's really hard to recover. You know when you're doomed in Monopoly. You know, you can tell. You've got some resources, but there's going to be some crisis when you land on some hotel, and you're going to get wiped out. You know it. So there's a point at which you're headed for zero, even if you have something. You know, and you might be rescued by luck, but you know when you're doomed. So what happens is that as you continue to play Monopoly, more and more people stack up as zero, and fewer people have more and more money, and when the game is over, everyone has nothing except one person, and they have all of it. Now the funny thing about that is that in some sense that's how trading games work. You know, you might wonder why there is inequality in a society, and it's easy to consider that it's because the society is corrupt, and perhaps, you know, societies are somewhat or horribly corrupt. That's the variation. There's no society that's without its criminal element and fixed element. Anyways, trading games tend to produce a Pareto distribution so that very many people have very little and a tiny minority have a tremendous amount. That's the 1% that you hear about, right? And you know, the thing about that 1% is that that's happened in every society that's ever been studied. It doesn't really matter what the governmental system is, and it certainly happened under the Soviets, that's for sure. And there was a lot of people who had enough zero so they just died. So you know, the utopian dream was completely unimplementable for a variety of very complex reasons. One is that it's very hard to fight against that distribution pattern when people are trading, because mere statistics will do that. And then there's other things that, and I should tell you as well that the Pareto distribution governs a lot of things. So like if you look at books, if I remember properly, last year there was something like 1 million English language books published, and I think 500 of them sold more than 100,000 copies, which is none, right? That's none. And of that 500 you can be sure that one of them was by Stephen King, and he took half the money, because there's like 5 authors in the English language who are on every airport paperback stand, occupying the top rung, and that's massive real estate, right, because it's replicated everywhere. And because they're so prominent, and because they're known names, when people are in a hurry and they just want something to read, they just grab that, and then more money goes to those people. And so, you know, success breeds success, and failure breeds failure, and it's not necessarily linear. And that's a really difficult thing to deal with, and it's hard on societies, because one of the things we do know is that, you know, as you stretch out the inequality, you make men, particularly on the lower end of the distribution, more and more likely to be aggressive. It's sort of like, you imagine every man has a threshold for violence, and status is important to men. Not that it's not important to women, but it's different. It's a different kind of status. Status is important to men because it's one of the things that makes them marketable as partners to women. So it actually turns out to be quite important to men. The men tend to compete with one another for status, hierarchy position. And in a really unequal society, if you're like a low rung guy, then, and you don't have any opportunity to rise because the society isn't structured so that there's mobility, then the more aggressive guys tend to turn to criminality. And you know, and so you could say there's a threshold for criminality, and the more inequality pressure you put on a particular area, geographic or political area, the more inequality pressure you put on it, the more men slip past that threshold and into criminality. And you know, there's been pretty good studies done of drug gang in Chicago. That was the best one. A sociologist actually went and hung out with a drug gang for, he got into it. I guess the drug gang leader was, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily narcissistic, but that might be a reasonable way of thinking about it. And he was kind of happy with the idea of maybe being the subject of a book. And so this guy was able to associate with them, got to know them quite well. And then the housing project in which the gang was housed was slated for demolition, and the gang broke up. And he got the books, because they kept books. And what he found was the average street drug dealer, first of all, was employed in another job as well, and was making far less than minimum wage. Now, but the guys, you know, further up the chain, of course, followed the Pareto distribution, and so there was a tiny minority of them who were raking in a tremendous amount of loot, and the guys at the bottom were just waiting around for the possibility that they could rise up the hierarchy. And you know, it's a pretty violent game, so the chances that someone's going to be taken out is pretty high, and then a little slot opens up for some opportunistic second rater, and perhaps he can move up the hierarchy. So the Pareto distribution governs all sorts of other things too. I mentioned it governs the popularity of books, the sales of books, but it also characterizes the distribution of everything that people produce. So if you think of creative production of any sort, artistic production, industrial production, it doesn't matter. Almost everything fails, and a few things succeed beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Apple's a good example of that. I mean, the iPhone, they have their competitors, but it's an extraordinarily dominant product, and they rake in billions of dollars. I don't know if Apple is valued at $1 trillion, but it's close to that, and that's a lot of money. And I think, if I remember correctly, it's something like this. I probably have the figures wrong, but like the top 40 people, the richest 40 people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2 billion. Right? Now, it's not like they're stuffing their mattresses with that money, or they have a skyscraper full of cash. That money is out in the economy doing whatever money does. So, you can't spend $28 billion. So, and sometimes you can even do some good with it. Bill Gates seems to be doing something reasonable with his money. But the reason I'm telling you this is because one of the things you should know is that this proclivity for inequality is pervasive among the creative products of human beings. It's the case with goals scored in hockey. My son told me, and he's a reliable source on hockey statistics, that if Wayne Gretzky, if you don't count any of the points that Wayne Gretzky managed with scoring, he still had enough points just with assists to have more points than any hockey player that ever played. So, even at the upper end of the distribution, there's some person who's, they're so good at what they do, and then there's another person that's so much better than them that it's not even comparable. And so, and the benefits flow to people who are in that position, and you can understand why, I would say, because, let's say you start writing and you get a book, and rare things, very rare things to have happen, and then some people read it and they like it, and then of course it's much more likely that you'll get a next book, and if people like that, well, it's even more likely that you'll get a third book, and then people start to know who you are, and then because they know who you are, they phone you up and offer you opportunities, and your network grows, and it's like this exponential increase in your reach and your capacity for production, and more flows to you. And then on the other hand, if you start to fail, and why would someone fail? Well, God, one idea that's very common in our culture is that poverty is caused by lack of money, and that's a really stupid idea, because money is very difficult to handle. I had clients who were drug addicts, and the worst possible thing that could happen to them was that they got some money. They're just done. First of all, they were hanging around with people who were a little on the sociopathic side, and so especially if they weren't that bright and couldn't defend themselves very well, as soon as they got money, well, it was off to the bar with all the friends. And one guy I remember in particular, every time he got his disability check, he was gone for 5 days. You usually found him in a ditch, because he'd just go to the bar, spend every cent he had on alcohol and cocaine, and wake up in a ditch, 3/4 dead, eventually completely dead. And then he was ashamed and horrified and repentant, and he'd straighten himself out again, and then that was all well and good until, as long as he was broke, until the next check showed up, and then bang, the same thing. So it's not like money is necessarily a good for everyone. It's hard to manage money. It's really easy for it to disappear. I mean, elderly people have a hell of a time now because crooks are contacting them on the internet non-stop, and so just giving people money's like, it's like pouring water in their hands. It's not that helpful, not necessarily that helpful. And then of course contributors to poverty are, well, it's not so good to have a low IQ. People don't like the idea of IQ because it seems so arbitrary. You have a high IQ, well, it's not like you deserve it exactly. You're set up that way pretty much right from the beginning. It's very, 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 very stable. You can make a high IQ person stupider by not educating them up to the level of their possibility, but taking someone who has a low IQ and trying to raise that. It's like, if you can figure out how to do that, well, you know, it's Nobel Prize time for you, because people have tried that a lot, and most recently with those, you know, lumosity games and that sort of thing, and the evidence that those produce anything other than brilliant performances on the lumosity game itself is basically zero. We haven't been able to figure out how to see, because intelligence is a cross-domain phenomena, and you can get really good in a single domain by practicing like mad, and what you'd want is to practice like mad in a single domain and hope that it generalized to other domains. That's the holy grail of intelligence increase. It's like, no one's done it. People claim it, but the claims never hold up, and people have been trying for a long time to do it, and they haven't been able to do it. And differences in IQ really make a difference, you know. I mean, you guys, average IQ is probably 125, 130. At 115 you're at the 85th percentile, and 115 would barely get you going for a hard university. 130 you're probably graduate school material. You know, 145 you're up there at the range where you can probably do pretty much whatever you want, although as you get smarter the scatter between your abilities increases, so you might have a very high verbal IQ but not be so good at mathematics, or the other way around. But it's a massive contributor to lifetime success, and I don't know what to do about that. I mean, why do smart people make more money? Well, they get to where the edge of production is faster. So if you have 1,000 people and you rank order them by IQ, the smart people are going to come up with the new ideas first, and they're going to have more ideas, and they're going to strategize better. And you know, with an IQ of 90, which is 15% of the population, you think about that, it's 15% of the population. That's pretty much the threshold for reading instructions and being able to follow them. So, you know, and our society is increasingly sophisticated, so it's by no means obvious. You know, the liberals think, well, this society is unfair because there's unemployment, and the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone, but none of them think, well, there are massive, massive, massive differences in people's ability, far greater than anyone realizes, and that poses a structural problem. I had a client, and I got him a volunteer job, which is way harder than you think. You need a police check, for example. Like, it's harder to get a volunteer job than a real job. But we got him in a volunteer job, and he had to fold pieces of paper, letters. He worked at a charity. He had to fold pieces of paper in 3 so that he could put them inside envelopes. And then the letters, which were in a pile, had to be matched with the proper envelopes, which were also in a pile, but some of them were French and some of them were English, so the French ones had to be matched carefully to the French envelopes. And then if, you know, if there was one envelope out of order, well, then he had to figure out whether it was the papers that were out of order or the letters that were out of order. And then some of the letters had photographs attached to them, and you weren't supposed to bend the photographs, but they weren't always in the same place, so that meant you had to figure out how to fold the paper in 3 a bunch of different ways without creasing the photograph. And then the other thing is, and I never realized how difficult it is to put a piece of paper in an envelope till I watched someone who couldn't do it, and he probably had an IQ of about 80. You know, if you met him on the street you wouldn't think anything different of him. He was normal looking guy, had some other problems. I trained him to fold those damn papers for like 30 hours, and he got reasonably good at it. But you know, if you're good at it, and you probably all are, you fold it and the edges line up exactly, like really exactly. The tolerance is probably 1/2 millimeter, something like that. Then you do the second fold and the tolerance is the same. But let's imagine that the first fold you're out by 1/8 of an inch, and the second fold you're out by 1/8 of an inch, so it's a little crooked, and that means in total you're out by 1/4 of an inch. and then it won't fit in the damn envelope. So then you kind of crumple the envelope when you put it in there, and then it gets stuck in the sorting machine. And so he sweated blood trying to do that job, and they eventually planned to fire him. So imagine what that's like, eh? You know, you can't get a job, and then so you get a job at a charity as a volunteer, and a charity decides to fire you. You know, I mean, really, that's just... So I talked to the woman who was running it and suggested that that might be a little on the devastating side. I mean, she had her reasons. You know, he was always asking people questions about how to do his job, and you know, so that meant he was interfering with the productivity of other people, and it was genuine interference. I mean, she wasn't being mean, and it was her job to make sure the place did what it was supposed to. So you know, she was between a rock and a hard place. He eventually decided that the job wasn't for him, and relatively soon after that, I think it was too stressful, and he quit. So that solved that problem, except then he didn't have a job, which of course is a problem. It has a happy ending, this story, as far as I know. He got a dog because he was very lonesome, and that dog, man, having that guy train that dog, that was something else. That dog just, I think he lost 30 pounds while he was training that dog, because dogs, they're, you know, dominant, and he had to have a tussle with the dog to figure out who was in charge, and it's a lot of responsibility to have a dog, but he was pretty damn committed to that dog, and he managed it. And the things he went through to keep that dog, you just cannot possibly imagine. It was surreal, just like the nuclear missile silo. I mean, he had people following him around, informing on him because they thought he was abusing the dog, when in fact, because I watched, the dog was clearly abusing him. So he got a job helping a woman who trained dogs, and then he had a job. So hooray, you know, but it was like a miracle fundamentally. So anyways, the reason I'm telling you all this is because there was a reason for the Cold War. And the reason was that there's inequality, and there's different theories about how to address that inequality, and different theories about why it exists. And there was a Marxist theory about why it exists, which was roughly something like property equals theft, and those who have more have taken it from those who have less, which, you know, seems to me to eliminate any conceptualization that there isn't a fixed pot of money. You know, money expands actually as we become more technologically proficient, and lots of people who have money have it because they've generated a lot of wealth. I mean, Bill Gates is a great example of that, right? He popularized computing. He made it possible for everybody to have access to computing. It's like, it seems like a good for him, you know. And you could say the same thing about Steve Jobs, and maybe you'll be able to say the same thing about Elon Musk. And you know, these guys have tremendous resources at their disposal, but you know, they're not bathing in banknotes. You know, they're trying to continue to do things, and they use their money to do things. And anyways, the Russians set themselves up under Marxist presuppositions and tried to equalize the distribution of property, and to call that catastrophic barely scratches the surface. And I know that you guys probably don't learn much about this because for some reason people aren't taught about it, but you know, the good estimates are that the Russians killed about 30 million of their own people between 1919 and 1959. You know, and it's brutal. It's brutal. A lot of that was through starvation. You know, I saw a photograph the other day which I tweeted, which is the worst photograph I've ever seen in my life, and that's actually saying a lot, because I've seen a lot of really terrible photographs because I've done so much investigation into totalitarianism. This was a photograph that was taken during one of the early starvation periods in the Soviet Union, where about 3 million peasants died. It was a picture of a peasant couple standing behind a table at a market selling human body parts for food. It's like, and you know, I have this weird quirk, which I don't think does me much good, but maybe helps me understand things better. When I see that someone has done something extreme, I learned to do this a long time ago when I worked briefly in a maximum security prison. I try to imagine what I would have to be like, what kind of situation I would have to find myself in to do that. And believe me, man, that's a horrifying enterprise, because it is actually possible, no matter what it is that you read about someone doing, and no matter how unlikely it is that you think you would do that, it's possible to imagine yourself in that situation. And that, well, that's enlightening. That's what I would say. That's enlightening. You know, because one of the things about enlightenment is that you get enlightened by doing things that are necessary that you really, really, really do not want to know, don't want to do. And imagining yourself as a perpetrator of that sort is, that tells you something about the world, and it tells you something about human beings, but it's a hell of a thing to swallow, you know, in a very well structured society like ours, where we're so peaceful. Well, because we have the heat and it always works, and we have electricity and it always works, and we have plumbing, which is a bloody miracle, and it always works. You know, it's just one of the things that this imagination process has done for me is keep me alert to the absolute miracle that my life is every day. It's horribly cold out there. You can't grow any food. You die if you're out there for 24 hours. If any of this infrastructure was unreliable for any length of time, we would be in serious trouble. And it's never unreliable. It's so unlikely. And so here we are with all this reliable infrastructure, and because of that we don't really have to compete with each other much. I mean, some, you don't compete for food, you don't compete for shelter, or some people do, but not very many. So it's really easy to think of yourself as good, because, well, you're not doing anything nasty to anyone. But, you know, a cynic might say, well, that's just because you don't have any reason to. But those reasons have arisen many times in the past, and in fact they're the norm, not the exception. We're the exception. This insanely functional society that we've somehow managed to generate it's incomprehensible to me that it exists. So anyways, back in the at the end of the Industrial Revolution, you know, the conditions of the worker were pretty brutal. I mean, George Orwell wrote a book called Road to Wigan Pier, which I would highly recommend. It's a great book. And he went up in the 30s, I think it was the 30s, to live with the coal miners up in northern UK. And those poor guys, you know, they had to crawl to work for 2 miles down a tunnel that they couldn't stand up in, just to start their shift. And then after their 8 hours of, you know, hacking away at the coal walls, which is rather difficult and dirty and dangerous, and of course you get black lung from it, so it's also fatal, and of course they didn't get paid very much. So after doing that for 8 hours, then you crawled back your 2 miles, and you didn't get paid for that. That was just the commute. And the housing for those people was not good. The food wasn't good. Most of them had no teeth by the time they were 30. You know, I mean, being poor was no joke, even in a place like the UK, which was relatively well off. And so there was every reason to be concerned about the disparity between rich and poor. And poor is the natural state, you know, that in the Western world in 1895 the typical person lived on $1 a day in today's dollars. And you know, that's not uncommon in many places in the world now. So there were reasons to be concerned with inequality. And you know, the Russians took one pathway inspired by Marx, and we took another pathway inspired by John Stuart Mill and John Locke and the English tradition, I would say, of democracy, and competed for 70 years, and things seem to have worked out better here, but it was a hell of a competition, and there were real differences in opinion at the bottom of it, and those two systems turned into armed camps, and that's not over exactly, you know, I mean, there's the Chinese, although they're a hybrid now between communism and capitalism, and hopefully they're more interested in getting rich than they are in, you know, having a war. Greed is a good motivator, surprisingly enough, it's kind of reliable. But anyways, by 1989 the jig was up. It was obvious that the Soviet system was not functional. There were no consumer goods, that's for sure, even in the main department stores in Moscow, and people just kind of lost faith in the whole project. You know, it became, for a while, I don't know if you know about the show Dallas. Dallas was a soap opera that ran at night, a serial, and it was about these rich Texans who lived, you know, a 1% lifestyle, and it was the most popular show in East Germany. The streets would empty so that people could watch Dallas. Well, when you're sitting in your horrible Soviet architecture flat that, you know, you had to struggle to get with your informing relatives, because 1 out of 3 people in East Germany was an informer, a government informer, and you watch Dallas, you know, there's a little cognitive dissonance occurring, and so it fell apart, and quite peacefully actually. You know, there was a bit of war in Eastern Europe, but it fell apart remarkably peacefully, and so here we are, and we don't know what to do with the pesky Russians, but at least there's no evidence that there are mortal enemies for fundamental reasons of axiomatic presupposition. And things are a lot better in the world, despite what everyone tells you, than they were 40 years ago, and they're so much better than they were 50 years ago that it's absolutely staggering. We've lifted more people out of poverty in the last 15 years that have been lifted out of poverty in the entire history of the world before then. People are gathering economic resources at a rate that even the wildest optimist really couldn't dream of speeding up. So it's not like we're without our problems, but so during that period of time I was obsessed, is a good word, with a question, and the question was, why would human beings produce 2 camps and then produce a massive arsenal of hydrogen bombs? And I don't know what you know about hydrogen bombs, but they have atom bombs for triggers. And you know, that's worth thinking about, because an atom bomb, you know, hey, that's something. But a hydrogen bomb, that's the sun. That's really something. So, and you know, they were at the peak of the Cold War, and this is still true to some degree, there were literally tens of thousands of these weapons aimed at the Soviet Union and at the West, and that was enough to pretty much put an end to everything. And that's a dangerous game, man, you know, and not only because of intent, but also because of the possibility of accidental, just an accident, you know, just a mistake, or just someone who's a little crazier than you might want them to be, you know. And you might think, well, no one would want to bring about the destruction of the world, but that just means you don't know very much about Stalin, because of all the people who lived in the 20th century who had power, Stalin was the most motivated to bring everything to an end. There's some evidence that he was murdered by Khrushchev and his crew, and Khrushchev was the next leader, and if he wasn't murdered, he was at least not provided with medical attention when he was dying. And there is reasonable evidence that he was gearing up to invade Western Europe, and he didn't really care how much destruction would go along with that. I mean, he'd already killed tens of millions of people. He had a lot of practice. He was good at it. It didn't really bother him. Maybe even enjoyed it. So, what the hell? That's what I thought. How can it be that we are doing this? It's so insane. And so then I started to think about belief systems, you know, because you could say that each camp had its own belief system. The one in the West was derived, it had a very lengthy history, derived from the Greeks and the Romans and the Jews and the Christians, and from various schools of philosophy, and from the Enlightenment and all of that. And then the Soviet Union was basically predicated on a rational philosophy that opposed the axioms that the West had evolved, and each group organized their societies around that. And you know, I took political science for quite a long time, and the political scientists and the economists, they basically thought that people competed over resources. But that wasn't a very good answer as far as I was concerned, because it wasn't obvious to me why people valued the resources they valued. The economists just assume that there's resources that you value, but you know, people can value a lot of different things. It's not exactly fixed. I mean, you tend to value food very highly if you're hungry, obviously, but you know, there's lots of things that we value and that we want that seem somewhat arbitrary, somewhat like a decision. So I got more interested in why people valued things and what it meant to value something, and then what it meant to believe something, and then how it could be that someone could believe something so deeply that they would risk their own death to protect it, or at least risk the death of other people, and maybe on a massive scale. Like, man, people are committed to their system. Now, you know, a system of belief is not just a system of belief. That's one of the things that I came to understand, is that it's not appropriate to make this too psychological. People defend their belief systems, but that's not exactly right. You know, we have a shared belief system. Well, it's sufficiently shared so that here we are, we don't know each other, we're a bunch of primates, we're in this room and it's peaceful and no one's scared, and that's pretty amazing, and that means that we're all acting out our roles. So we're acting out our roles, and we have an expectation with regards to those roles, and those two things match, and that's the important thing, and we'll talk about that a lot. It isn't the belief system or the integrity of the belief system even, it's the match between the belief system and the actions of the other people within the belief system. What you want to maintain is that match. You want to act out your beliefs in the world, and you want what you want to happen. That's a good thing, you get what you want and you validate your belief system. Great, perfect, security. But a lot of that is, if we're interacting, even right now, there's a whole set of expectations that are governing what we're doing. Like, you don't want me to take your little tablet there and smash it. That would be shocking, right? You wouldn't know what the hell to do, right? You'd be somewhere different if I did that, and you wouldn't know where you were. And that's another thing to know, because that's a fundamental difference. There's a fundamental difference between knowing where you are and not knowing where you are. I think it's, in some sense, the fundamental difference. You can think about it as the distinction between explored and unexplored territory, but you have to. I don't know if you've ever taken a cat to a new house. Cats hate that. And because in their old house, and maybe in their old neighborhood, they've slunk around, you know, at the edges, checking everything out. They start out afraid. They check everything out. They know where to hide. They know what's safe, and they know that because they go somewhere and nothing happens, and so then they assume that it's safe, and they slowly build up a neighborhood that they're comfortable with. My dad used to take the dog for a walk, and then the cat got lonesome, and so it started to follow him, and first of all it would just go along the buildings, the houses on their route, you know, hiding really from predators. And after a while I got kind of comfortable with that, and then it would follow right behind the dog, but it had a border, and if my dad took the dog over one street too many for the cat would just sit on the corner and you know, cry like a cat cries. It was like, that's it for me, man, I'm not going any farther out into the unknown. And so the distinction between the territory that you have mastered and the territory that you haven't mastered is a fundamental distinction. It's the distinction between home and the strange land. And the thing about familiar territory for people is that most of the familiar territory that we inhabit is other people, because we're so social. So you can't really think, it's a weird way of thinking about territory. It's not exactly geographical objective territory, it's territory with a dominance hierarchy in it. And the dominance hierarchy has a predictable structure, and you know where you fit in it most of the time, and so that when you act out in that territory surrounded by your people, then often you get what you want, and you're so thrilled about that because you just don't want someone acting erratically around you, like, and you know that. So you walk down Bloor and there's people there that should really be institutionalized, but we deinstitutionalized them all so they could be free, and free to be, you know, suffering and malfunctioning out on the street. That's what the freedom ended up being. But you know, you'll walk by someone like that who's muttering away to the voices in his head, and you know, maybe striking out against whatever it is that's plaguing him, and you won't make eye contact. You might even go across the street. You're certainly going to give him a wide berth. You're going to keep a distance between him and you, and you're going to hope that you don't attract his attention because he's not in the dominance hierarchy and you don't know what the hell he might do. And that's unexplored territory too. That's another way of thinking about it. Like, we inhabit time and space, not just space and not just time. We inhabit time and space, and our territories are spatial temporal. We're here now, and this is safe now, and it's safe partly because of the physical structure and it's working, but it's also safe because none of you are manifesting peculiar behavior. But if you started to manifest peculiar behavior, if you stood up and started muttering or yelling or maybe attacking someone next to you, all the rest of you would freeze first, because then all of a sudden this would be unexplored territory. The match between what you want, which is a peaceful lecture that you hope has some content, the match between what you want and what's happening has vanished. And so then you don't know where you are. And so then what do you do when you don't know where you are? What do you do when you don't know what to do? Well, if you're a computer, you just crash. But you know, what good is that to you? You're just going to die? That isn't helpful. You freeze first, and then maybe you cautiously attend, or maybe you don't. Maybe you just keep your damn eyes averted and you sit there and you hope that no one notices you. That's a prey response, right? That's like a rabbit frozen when it thinks a fox is looking at it. And we were prey animals for a long time. There was a cat that they recently discovered, a prehistoric cat that had this bottom single tooth, and they found out that a human skull fit right inside its mouth, and so it could grab you here and pierce the back of your skull with its single tooth, and that's what it was evolved for. So, you know, it's under such conditions we evolved, and we're predators obviously, but we're tasty predators, and so other things were perfectly happy to eat us. And so when you're where you don't know what to do, you act like a prey animal, and that's probably what you should do, because maybe if you keep your head down and shut the hell up, there won't be any attention attracted to you, and maybe you'll get through it. You know, you might decide, unlikely, to intervene and take the guy down, but you would be the exception rather than the norm, and it's unsurprising. Okay, so what I came to understand was that belief systems regulated emotions, but not exactly psychologically. Like, it isn't exactly it isn't exactly, and this is sort of like the terror management theories, it's not exactly like you have a theory in your head and the